Nobody puts this number in the chart, $200 a month below that line. Compound interest does not stop working. That is the wrong way to say it. It works. It just works so slowly that for a very long time it feels almost indistinguishable from doing something far less powerful than people promised you. That is why so many disciplined people look at their account after years of doing the right thing and quietly ask themselves a dangerous question. Is this it? I want to start there because I have seen too many people misunderstand what is actually happening in the first decade of investing. They think the strategy failed. They think the market return is too low. They think they picked the wrong fund. Usually none of that is true. Usually they are standing in the slow part of the same process they were told would eventually change their life. And nobody bothered to explain where that slow part ends and where the real acceleration begins. There are two phases to this game. If you do not separate them, almost every important decision gets harder than it needs to be. In the first phase, your money grows mostly because you keep feeding it. In the second phase, it grows mostly because the pile itself has become large enough to do real work. That sounds simple. It is simple. But the consequences are not simple at all. Most financial charts hide this because they are built to sell the dream of compounding, not to explain the experience of living through it. They show you the elegant curve. They do not show you the years where the curve feels flat enough to make a normal person doubt their own discipline. They do not show you the month where you stare at your statement and realize the returns still look tiny compared to what you personally had to sacrifice to put the money in there. So let us talk in real numbers, not slogans. Take an 8% annual return, not fantasy, not the kind of number people use to make a calculator sing for the camera. Just a reasonable long-term sober assumption. At $50 a month after one full year of discipline, your investment returns are roughly the price of a decent lunch. After 10 years, you have a balance that will not impress anybody and certainly will not change your life. Even after 30 years of doing everything right, missing nothing, staying in the fight, the result is still small enough that an ordinary household can burn through it faster than people think. That does not mean compounding failed. It means you never got the pile big enough for the percentage to matter. That is the central idea in this entire discussion. Before the pile reaches a certain size, you are the engine. Your monthly contribution is the engine. Your discipline is the engine. Your sacrifice is the engine. The compounding is there, but it is not carrying the load. I want you to picture this the way a mechanic would picture a turbocharger. A turbocharger is a beautiful device. It takes what looks like waste and feeds it back into the system to create more power. But a turbo has a threshold below a certain level. It is technically there, but you do not feel it. The engine is still doing almost all the work itself. Then the boost kicks in. Same machine, same parts, completely different experience. Your portfolio works the same way. Before a certain threshold, your return is real but not meaningful enough to feel in your life. After that threshold, the whole experience changes. For most people, that threshold shows up somewhere around $100,000 to $150,000 invested. That is not a magic number from heaven. It is just the rough zone where 8% annual growth starts producing enough dollars to rival what you are putting in with your own hands. At $10,000 invested, 8% is $800 a year. That is not $10 million, but is not enough to alter your financial identity. At $100,000 invested, 8% becomes $8,000 a year. Now you are talking about real monthly output. At $500,000 invested, 8% is $40,000 a year. Now the pile is no longer a hobby. It is becoming a serious economic force in your life. The percentage did not change. The pile changed. That is the point almost everybody misses. They get obsessed with the percentage while the pile is still too small for the percentage to rescue them. Let me make this more concrete. If you invest $200 a month at 8% after 10 years, you have a result that looks respectable on paper and underwhelming in the soul. After 20 years, it finally begins to feel like a real base. After 30 years, it becomes substantial. But the transition is not smooth in the way people think. The important thing is not the final number alone. The important thing is the moment the portfolio crosses into the zone where returns begin to do as much or more work than you do. That is the phase transition. That is the month the machine starts helping you in a way you can finally feel. And that month arrives far sooner for the person contributing $400 a month than for the person contributing $50. Same return, same compounding law, different fuel. Now I want to pause on something else because this is where people begin making very expensive mistakes. When phase one feels slow, most people diagnose the problem incorrectly. They think the return rate is too low. So they start chasing. They move from the boring fund to the exciting stock. They listen to the friend with a hot tip. They start reading newsletters that promise outperformance. They redirect precious early dollars into things they do not understand because the honest, patient route feels too quiet to trust. This is one of the costliest errors in all of investing. In phase one, the lever that moves your future is almost never the difference between a decent return and a spectacular return. It is the difference between a decent contribution and a serious contribution. If you are investing $200 a month and somehow by a miracle you double your return assumption for a decade, the result is better. Of course it is better, but not nearly as much better as people imagine, especially once you account for the behavior required to actually stay inside that kind of volatility. That is the part people always leave out. They compare a neat spreadsheet against the life of a human being. They assume you will calmly endure the giant drawdowns, the scary headlines, the years of disappointment, and the temptation to quit at exactly the worst moment. That is not how ordinary people behave. The real return most investors get from aggressive strategies is usually far lower than the spreadsheet promised, because behavior eats theory for breakfast. On the other hand, if you simply lift the monthly contribution from $200 to $350 or $400 while keeping the same boring 8% assumption, the math improves dramatically without asking you to become a genius, a trader, or a prophet. That is why I keep returning to the same sentence. In phase one, contributions are the strategy. Compounding is the reward you collect later. I have enormous respect for people who understand this early because they save themselves from years of unnecessary confusion. Think about the famous teacher who quietly built over $1 million on an ordinary salary. Most people study that story and conclude that frugality was the whole lesson. Frugality matters, but it is not the deepest lesson. The deepest lesson is that he pushed enough monthly capital into the machine, early enough to reach the point where the machine started doing serious work before retirement ran out of runway. That is a very different insight. Packing lunch is not the point. The point is what the packed lunch funds before the threshold. The lunch matters. After the threshold, the portfolio has its own momentum, and that leads me to the most important reversal in this whole conversation. You think the problem is the market return. The real problem is almost always the contribution level. Now let me show you why that matters in actual human life. Imagine a man named Marcus. He is 38. He works in logistics management. He makes a respectable living. Not flashy, not broke. Just a solid middle-class income that should, in theory, be enough to build a serious future if handled properly. 8 years ago, his company offered a retirement plan. He did what responsible people do. He signed up. He chose a diversified target, date fund. He set the contribution at $150 a month. Then he did the hardest thing in investing. He kept going. No missed deposits, no panic sales, no wild speculation. After 8 years, he looks at the balance. It is not life changing. It is not even close. He has done what every book and every advisor told him to do, and his result still feels too small to justify the emotional energy he has spent believing in it. This is the dangerous psychological point. Marcus is not making a math error. He is making a time and scale error at $150 a month. He has been below the threshold the entire time. The machine has not failed him. The machine has simply not yet reached the operating speed where the feedback loop becomes visible. Now run 3 paths for the same man. If Marcus keeps contributing $150 a month into retirement, he gets somewhere. But where he gets is not the place he thought the brochures were implying. At retirement age, the balance is helpful but not liberating. If Marcus raises the number to $400 a month, now the trajectory begins to change meaningfully. Not because 400 is a glamorous number, because it gets him to the threshold earlier. It gives phase 2 more years to work. If Marcus raises the number again to $600 a month, the difference becomes even more dramatic, not linearly dramatic, structurally dramatic. The reason is not simply that he invested more money. It is that he reached the point where the portfolio could finally begin carrying its own weight with enough time left for that to matter. That is the entire secret hidden inside almost every inspiring compounding chart. They are not just showing you a return rate, they are showing you what happens after a threshold has already been crossed. Now I want to get very practical, because theory is only useful if it changes what you do next. There are really 3 ways to move through phase 1 faster. The first is the simplest and the one people neglect most often: contribution. Right-sizing. Most people set a number years ago and never revisit it. They chose a contribution level when the account was opened, when their salary was lower, when their life looked different, when the future still felt abstract. Then the years pass, income rises, expenses change, the number stays frozen. That is pure institutional inertia. Not poverty, not inability, inertia. The easiest action in the world is to log in and add $50 a month. Let's put as $50 changes your life tomorrow, because $50 repeated with time becomes a surprisingly large pile. One boring login can end up being worth tens of thousands of dollars over a long horizon. And the real trick is not just doing it once. The real trick is deciding that every January, without negotiation, you will review that number again. You do not need to promise yourself that you will make a huge leap every year. You only need to promise yourself that the number will not be left unattended. The second accelerant is income growth redirection. This is where many fortunes are won quietly and many are lost quietly. Raises happen, bonuses happen, tax refunds happen, side income appears. For most people, that extra money enters life and vanishes into convenience before it ever reaches the balance sheet. A little nicer meal plan, a little nicer car, a little nicer set of subscriptions, nothing outrageous, just enough drift to ensure that new income never becomes new capital. The right move is brutally simple. Take half of every income increase and redirect it to investments before lifestyle gets a vote. That is one of the cleanest rules I know. It still lets life improve. It still gives you room to breathe. But it ensures that every step forward in earnings also advances the timeline of the portfolio. This is not austerity. It is architecture. You are designing where the new money goes before habit and convenience claim it. The third accelerant is what I call the contribution reset at life. Event moments. This one is massively underrated. A car loan ends. A student loan disappears. A refinance lowers your monthly burden. A child becomes financially independent. A recurring payment dies at that exact moment. Money is suddenly free that did not feel free before. If you do not pre-decide where that money goes, lifestyle will take it almost instantly. It will not look dramatic. That is the danger. You will simply stop noticing that it ever became available. But if you capture even half of that released cash flow the day it clears, you can move your future in a very meaningful way without ever feeling like your life got worse. That is one of the best tricks in personal finance because it uses the moment of transition instead of fighting against the moment of desire. And now we come to the most painful truth of all. The most valuable dollars in your investing life are not the dollars you invest later when you are finally comfortable. They are the dollars you invest early, when they still have a full runway. A dollar invested in the first year of a 30-year journey has an entirely different level of economic power than a dollar invested in year 25. The late dollar still helps. Of course it helps, but it cannot possibly do what the early dollar could have done with all those extra years. That means every year you delay fixing the contribution problem is not a small delay. It is a sacrifice of your highest quality compounding years. That is why I dislike casual advice that says, start small without finishing the sentence. Yes, start small if that is what it takes to begin. But do not stay small indefinitely and call that prudence. Start small was supposed to reduce friction at the beginning. It was never supposed to become a permanent identity. The right sequence is very different. Start small, build the habit, automate the behavior. Then increase the number as early and as often as your life honestly allows. The reason is simple. The first 5 years matter more than people think, not because they look impressive, because they contain some of the most powerful dollars you will ever invest. Now let me tell you what all this really means. If you are still in phase 1, your job is not to become a better stock picker. Your job is not to find a magical extra % of return. Your job is not to obsess over tiny differences in fund design. While ignoring the giant difference in contribution size, your job is to get the engine up to speed. That is the assignment. Everything else is secondary. Once the engine is up to speed, you will have more room for elegance. Before then, you need fuel. That is why lazy investing, done correctly, built more wealth than 1,000 exciting ideas ever did. The people who win this game are not usually more brilliant. They are more structurally sound. They understand which phase they are in. They do not ask phase 2 questions while they are still in phase 1. So here is what I would do if I were you tonight. First, pull up your last statement and compare what came from your contributions versus what came from market growth. If your monthly additions are still doing most of the work, stop pretending the main decision is return optimization. You are still building the pile. Second, calculate your threshold date. Figure out when your current path gets you to $100,000, then ask a better question. What monthly contribution would get me there 2 years sooner? That answer will tell you more about your future than another month of reading market headlines. Third, pre-decide the next income event, the next raise, the next bonus, the next loan that disappears. Write down now how much of it goes into investments. Decide before the money arrives, because If you wait until the money is sitting there, your emotions will negotiate against your future. That is how people stay stuck in phase one for decades, and that is how people escape it too. There is nothing wrong with compounding. There is nothing wrong with the SP 500. There is nothing wrong with the quiet, boring route. The thing that is usually wrong is that the investor never fed the machine enough early enough for the machine to reveal what it can really do. Once you understand that, the discouragement starts to lose its grip. You stop asking why the first years feel so underwhelming. You start asking a far better question: how fast can I get this engine into boost? That is the real game. And if you learn that early, you give yourself something very valuable. Not a fantasy, not a hot tip, not a promise, a real shot.